Hello and welcome back to PaleoCast. I'm Liz Martin Silverstone, and today you're listening to episode 145 on Scleromochlus with Dr. Davide Foffa of Virginia Tech and the University of Birmingham. This episode stems from a recently published Nature paper that Davide did with some colleagues on Scleromochlus and its links to pterosaurs, which is an obvious reason why I'm so interested in it. The other reason that I think this study is really cool is that Davide did some of the scanning at Bristol with me, and it's actually really nice to see material that you've scanned out in the world, and especially when it's incredibly difficult material to scan and also to interpret, which you'll understand more about if you have a look at our website for some of the images of Scleromochlus. And as always, please do like and share on social media. I hope you enjoy this episode. Today I'm speaking with Dr. Davide Foffa, who's a postdoctoral fellow at Virginia Tech and the University of Birmingham, all about his new paper on Scleromochlus. Thank you for joining me today, Davide. Can you introduce yourself and tell us how you ended up in Virginia and in your current role?
Yeah, thank you for having me, first of all. So I did my undergrad in Italy at the University of Pisa in geological sciences after a little period in maths. After that, I moved to Bristol, doing the master in paleobiology, where I started working on marine reptiles and biomechanics, and where I was introduced to the Triassic thanks to the Bristol Dinosaur Project. After that, after a couple of years, I moved to Edinburgh. I kept working on marine reptiles at the University of Edinburgh. And then finally moved to the actual Triassic still in Edinburgh, but at the National Museum of Scotland, where I did my first postdoc. And the work I'm going to talk about today is about that period of time. I'm currently at Virginia Tech as a visiting researcher. So I'm for another postdoc at the university, which is primarily based at the University of Birmingham.
And of course, most importantly, during your master's is when you met me.
Absolutely, yes.
All right, well, let's just get started. I guess the first thing to ask you is, what is Scleromochlus? Because I think it's probably something that most people won't be familiar with.
Yeah, it's not one of the most famous reptiles or famous fossils, and for many good reasons, I think. So Scleromochlus, well, what it is, it's a big question because it has been debated for forever, since when it was discovered. So this animal was discovered about 130 years ago. Up in Scotland, nearby a small town called Elgin in Morayshire. So Scleromochlus is a reptile. There is agreement about that. Pretty much after that, it has been debated. So if you look at it, it's relatively small. It would probably fit on the palm of your hand. It's about 20 centimeter long, super small, which has been one of the reasons why it has been difficult to study. It was firstly found, described by Woodward in 1907. And since then, many different researchers have tried to understand its anatomy, which has been very difficult because it is really poorly preserved.
What makes it so poorly preserved?
So the fossils in the Elgin area, which are collectively called the Elgin reptiles, they are
very original.
Yeah, I know, right? They are preserved as cavities in sandstone.
Okay.
So sometimes you still have some bone material, but when that happens, it's normally reducing to shards. that creates many problems because if you have sharded material into a hard sandstone, you cannot really prepare it. So what has happened in the past is that as soon as quarry workers would see a hole in sandstone, they would split in half, hoping that there was a fossil in there. And then most of the study has been based either on looking at the molds or actually pouring into these cavities peels, moldy material like waxes and other materials, and then peel them off. This has some problems because while it works quite well for larger animals, so you have a pretty accurate depiction of what the holes look like and so what the bones looked like. For small animals, the density of the material that you're pouring into the holes, it's too thick to penetrate completely, which means that you are not capturing the entirety of the skeleton, as we found out recently. So these methods are still pretty accurate in terms of how reliable the bones are, except for the completeness, of course.
So it's literally just holes in the rock for the most part?
For the most part, yes. Yeah.
And is that the same reason why we don't really have a good reconstruction of it up to date?
Yes. I have no doubt that previous research, when they did their reconstruction, they did it with all the information that they had. However, the techniques that have been used to study this animal which demonstrated it did not allow to capture the entirety of the anatomy of the skeletons. Other reason is that these skeletons, not only they are not preserved as bones, but they are also mostly flattened.
And what was it about the anatomy that they could see before that led people to believe that it was closely related to pterosaurs?
Right. Yeah. For a long time, Scleromochlus has been hypothesized to be very closely related to pterosaurs, if not a flightless pterosaur. And mainly it is due to the general body shape of this animal. So Scleromochlus has a very large, long head, which is about half the length of the vertebral column up to the tail, which is something that is in common with pterosaurs. So if you look at pterosaur, they have a really long head, which it's about the same size, if not slightly less than the torso, essentially.
They have stupidly large heads.
They do. And Scleromochlus goes towards that trend. So its head is about half the length of its torso and neck combined.
And was that the only thing that people thought led it towards pterosaurs?
So it's still a small animal. There was some other discussed information that we analyzed in our paper. So another of this feature is that it was thought that the humerus was shorter than the forearm. So ulna and radius. We show that this is not the case, but it's a good example of one of those bones that has been captured by the peels only partially. So we found an entire bit that was going within the matrix that it could not be captured. Another feature is regards the orientation of the quadrant. So essentially the articulation between the skull and the lower jaw. In pterosaurs, it tends to be too deep anteriorly, and that was thought to be the case for Scleromochlus as well. Now, as I mentioned before, the specimens of Scleromochlus are all flattened. So how reliable this interpretation was, it has been discussed, but we found another fairly complete quadrant and it in fact shows that it was dipping more likely posteriorly, like a more standard reptile.
Kind of backtracking a little bit, if not related to pterosaurs, what were the other things that people thought that it was closely related to?
Yeah, absolutely. So Scleromochlus has been put almost everywhere in the Archosaur family tree. So Archosaur is that group that include modern crocodiles and birds and all their ancestors and descendants. So in fact, Scleromochlus was also put outside Archosaurs, but in a bigger group called Archosauromorphs. So Scleromochlus has been thought to be very close to the origin of Archosaurs. It has been thought to be closely related to dinosaur. It has thought to be closely related to pterosaur, and sometimes also in the crocodile line Archosaurs. So in a group called Pseudosuchia.
Interesting. So it's really gone all over the place.
Yeah, and that actually tells you how difficult it has been to interpret the anatomy of these animals. So one of the reasons why it was included towards the root of Archosauromorphs is that it was thought to have osteoderm, so a sort of armor like crocodiles have. And that was also probably one of the characters that brought it into Pseudosuchia in the past.
Interesting. So why did you decide to look at it more closely?
So as part of my postdoc at the National Museum of Scotland, we decided to look more closely generally at the Elgin reptile fauna. And that's because we had run some tests scanning unprepared specimens of the Elgin fauna and found entire skeletons that had not been described before. So it was natural to think about what has already been studied and whether CT scans and more advanced technology could reveal more details on what we already know. And that proved to be the case in actually a couple of papers that we wrote. So the first one was about we decided primarily to target at the beginning to target unprepared specimen, and through understanding how the bones were preserved and how much we could gain from CT scanning the blocks of the specimens, we decided to go further and look at animals that were not so well understood as exactly Scleromochlus is.
So you use CT scanning to look at it. Why?
That's right.
Why is CT scanning useful in this case?
Yeah, that's a good question. There are multiple reasons. I'll start with one that probably people do not think about. So when I mentioned the peels, those are nowadays the only available tools to look at these specimens. They have been done several years ago, decades ago, more often than not. And they are turning into horrible things. So some are turning into gooey material. They're becoming very oily. So we are losing definition of those. Some are on the opposite, depending on the material you used, are crumbling down. So they're literally disappearing. And that's one of the reasons. So to be able to provide a durable substitute to these deteriorating casts, that's probably the main conservation reason. There are multiple others. So CT scan is not destructive. So if in the future we find another specimen from the quarries or one that have not been prepared, instead of having to crack it in half and then do the molding process, we can just CT scan it. We show that this work, it revealed as much, more information than the previous techniques. And so there's only advantages in doing so. another advantage is that the peels, as I said, do not reach all the cavities. So a lot of details are left unnoticeable, unnoticed. So this could be for a couple of reasons. One, as I said before, that the density of the material that you use is too thick to get into small cavities. Mm-hmm. The other one is that if there is a sun bone preserved in one of the holes, then your material for peeling will stop there. And it has been, we actually shown that in a couple of other reptiles, this had been the case, and we lost an entire part of the skeleton because of that. Ultimately, as well, you can have cavities that are not connected to other cavities. Mm. So if you think of at your hand and you remove of the cartilage, your bones do not touch each other. So if you think of preserving that in sandstone and then remove the bone, the bones will be isolated one from another.
Yeah, it's kind of an interesting thing. I think, most people, when you think about CT scanning, you think of viewing the bones within the rock. But in this case, if you're just seeing the holes, how much detail can you actually get from just holes in the rock?
Yeah, right. So fortunately, in the case of Scleromochlus and most of the reptiles that I worked on from the Elgin Fauna, the blocks are relatively small. So CT scans works well with high contrast density. Mm-hmm. So if the matrix and the target, in this case the holes, have a very high density contrast, they should theoretically be kept better. Now we have a cavity, so essentially air, versus a hole versus a matrix or hard sandstone, which is pretty good contrast. Well, as you know, we have it the other way around, so it would be better if the target would be higher density and surrounded by nothing.
Sure.
But in that case, would be a skeleton. So, but no, it has worked well. One unexpected issue that I had while reconstructing the skeleton is that the blocks were broken, which means that we had to put together the two slabs, the two halves together. And you probably remember some ingenious elastic band work with that.
Yes.
But still, you obviously cannot make the blocks match perfectly because,
of course,
time has passed, grains have gone, and so you still have that break plane that appears in the CT scans. And that break plane, if you think about it, connects the air from the outside with everything that has been molded in the inside, which is an absolute pain to isolate.
As Davide kind of alluded to, I actually helped out with some of the CT scanning for this project. So I've known this was going on for a while, and I do remember some very interesting, like 4 or 5 pieces trying to stick together and hold them together with various different elastic bands and plastic and foam so we could scan it.
That was fun for both of us, I think.
In terms of the specimens, because there's not very many Scleromochlus specimens around, did you look at all of them, and how many of them exist?
Yes, so there are 6 specimens, but 7 individuals, if you want to riddle that.
Okay.
So there are essentially 6 specimens, and in one of these blocks, there are 2 individuals that are sort of curled up together.
Okay.
So 2 individuals in there. Multiple blocks for each specimen, though.
And did you look at all 6?
Yes, we did scan all of them. Some at the in Bristol and some at the Natural History Museum in London.
Are they all fairly complete, or do some of them only have a head or, various parts of the body?
Right. So they are, most of them, fairly complete. Not all of them have heads, which has been a problem, but we have at least 5 heads.
Okay. It's not bad.
Yes.
5 of 7.
Yeah, some better preserved than others. Then most of them have the middle part of the body, so vertebral column, limbs. What tends not to be so preserved are the extremities, so or let's say visible. So fingers, claws, tail. That's another part that has been misinterpreted for a long time.
Were any of those parts particularly important for what you wanted to look at, or does it not really matter that they're gone?
Overall, if we overlap all the specimens, we have pretty much a complete picture of what the animal looked like. Okay. So while it was frustrating sometimes to not have complete parts to compare, to look at proportion in the same specimen, we've been able to do that in most of other cases.
And what were you able to figure out that was kind of previously unknown? I know you've mentioned a few things already, like the quadrate and things about the arm, but were there other features that we just didn't see before and now we have?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the bizarre things when you looked at Scleromochlus is that it has been described for a long time as I mentioned before, as an animal with a big head, with a shallow torso. So the ribs have been depicted to be very short. The forelimb a bit short as well. Super short tail as well, with a very long hind limb. So what we discovered is that, first of all, while preservation has been recognized as an issue, it has probably been underestimated. So these specimens are completely flattened. And we know that because we were able to find a lot more of the rib cage. So the pills were able to capture about a third of the length of the ribs. And the CT scans instead showed us that the ribs were much longer, much more curved, which has a lots of implication in terms of the ecology of this animal. So it has been suggested that Scleromochlus, because of the short ribs, was sprawling on the ground. But the fact that we found very long ribs that have been collapsed on a single plane by taphonomy means that when we reconstruct it back, it was probably looking much more like a normal animal at the time, if I can say that unkindly.
Not a pancake.
Yeah.
Are you able to kind of retro-deform the flattened bones back into what you think they would look like, or are they just way too flat?
Right, that's an interesting question, because the bones themselves are not so horribly deformed. Okay. In some specimens are, in others the bones are fine. It's just the skeleton that has collapsed on a plane.
I see.
Yeah, this has been puzzling us for a long time, but we argue that it reminds us to sort of mummified animals. So when you go in a very dry area in the desert, you can see sometimes lizards that are sort of flattened on a plane, but fairly complete. And their bones are actually fairly complete as well. And another reason why we think about this mechanism of preservation is that the Scleromochlus themselves are fairly complete. So if they had been scavenged extensively, we would not find many of the bones, but the disarticulation is there, but it is minimal, suggesting that the animal was buried relatively quickly and then deformed afterwards. The skulls are a problem because they are very tiny, made of very thin bones, and so they have completely collapsed. But there was no way that this animal, which is 20 centimeter long, would have a skull that was half a centimeter tall. That was not happening.
Yeah.
The tail is another part of the skeleton that has benefited a lot from the CT scans. So the tail has been described variously as long, short. More recently, it has been more accepted as short. So you look at sometimes reconstruction of Scleromochlus as an animal that was jumping around like a little kangaroo with a very short tail. This is not the case. So we showed that several of the specimens available have their tail continues within the matrix, and it was nearly, if not longer, than the rest of the body. So fairly long tail.
Interesting. We'll come back to the hopping in a minute because I definitely want to ask about that. But before I forget, you mentioned about the preservation and that you think it was something that was buried more quickly because it was sort of after burial that it got flattened. Do you know much about, this isn't specific to Scleromochlus, but that the kind of the Elgin reptiles, do you know the setting of how these animals were preserved?
Yes. So the Triassic fauna of the Elgin reptiles are all found associated with desert dunes. And particularly, they seem to be buried by an advancing desert dunes at the base of them, not in the middle, just at the base. And I mentioned that because at the base of the sand dunes, there's also indication of some layers that may or may not have been deposited by water.
Interesting.
But yeah, the Scotland at the time was much lower closer to the equator than it is now, and much warmer as well.
Yeah, not much of a desert nowadays, I think.
No.
So this would have been something like, if you think of rapid burial, this is kind of a sand dune moving onto it.
Yeah, most of the animals are actually buried in what has been described as life position. Now, I just said that it is the case, but perhaps not as close to life as it was. So I personally do not think that this thing had been buried and killed by the burial. They've been dead for a while and then covered. Okay. There are some quite cute specimens in which some animal, in fact, one is Scleromochlus, seems to cover its nostrils, which has been thought as evidence for rapid burial by advancing dunes.
Interesting.
There are some other beautiful animals like Brachyrhindon, which is an ancient relative of Tuataras, that are completely curled up or in a seemingly life position. So they're quite nice. You can see the curvature on their fingers. And
okay, now going back to hopping.
Hopping.
Because definitely I think of a lot of the sort of iconic imagery of Scleromochlus as, this animal that was kind of hopping around just like a kangaroo that you said. Now, you said that it didn't have a long tail, or it did have a long tail rather than a short one like previously thought. But Is there still any evidence that supports the idea that they were hopping around, or is that now gone?
Right. Pretty much like the relationship of Scleromochlus, this animal has also been discussed to do everything in terms of locomotion. There are indications that there are suggestions that it was an underwater animal as well at some point.
Oh.
It was not much discussed, and I don't think there was much evidence about that. But anyway, so Scleromochlus, yes, it has been discussed to be either animal that was hopping around like a little kangaroo, or sprawling around like a lizard, or moving like a frog as well. I'll start with the latter. So the idea that Scleromochlus was moving around like a frog does not seem to be consistent with the new information we have. I mentioned the torso that was deeper. I mentioned the head that was probably deeper than what it was reconstructed. But also, if you look at frogs, their pelvic girdle, so their hips essentially, have specific muscle attachments for this sort of behavior. The femur of Scleromochlus, so the thigh bone of Scleromochlus, seems to attach to the hip in a vertical manner, which also would seem to exclude the fact that this animal was sprawling. And it's also related, we can also use some of this feature to rule out that it was a hopper like a little kangaroo. So, for instance, let's start on why it has been suggested to be so. The main feature is the legs. So Scleromochlus has a very long foot, long tibia, and a shorter femur compared to these two, which is something characteristic of animals that hop around. However, it is also characteristic of animals that run fast, bipedal animals that run fast. Think of your tyrannosaur, well, theropods, to be more general. The feature to me that is missing the piece of the puzzle is missing to be sure that it was a hopper is that Scleromochlus does not have strong or reinforced hips. If you look at a small animal like birds, they still have a reinforced and fused hips to the vertebral column, which Scleromochlus does not seem to have. In fact, the hips of Scleromochlus are remarkably small, even for an animal of its size.
So, what does that mean it is doing?
Right. Yeah, that's the difficult part to answer. So,
if it's not hopping, what is it doing?
Yes. So there are some suggestions that it could have been a bipedal animal, so running on his hind limb. This is based on the proportion of the forelimb versus the hind limb and the length of the torso. We are in an ambiguous area because the forelimb are long and the hind limb are long too. So we are in a sort of middle area, which it has been sometimes called of facultative bipedal. So an animal that can walk on his hind limb, but could also walk on four.
Okay.
Now, just doing this sort of analysis on simple measurement is problematic because we have contrasting answers from different metrics. So this is actually something that we'll try to investigate in the future. Matt Hampage was able to reconstruct a complete model of Scleromochlus that we will be using for a more sophisticated biomechanical analysis, hopefully shortly.
So there's still more work to be done on Scleromochlus then?
Yes. there's quite a lot. So in terms of locomotion, there are a lot of other hypotheses to be looked at. We suggested that it was probably a facultative bipedal animal. We discussed a little bit why. That we discussed qualitatively that it doesn't have a specific adaptation for hopping or climbing, for instance. But it's also true that animals at a very small size do not need specific adaptation for climbing, for example. So there's a bit of confusion there. But it's something interesting to look at it in the future.
You're never going to be done with Scleromochlus.
No, probably not.
And now we haven't talked about kind of, to me, what's the most interesting part about Scleromochlus, going back to the ideas of pterosaur origins. Of course, pterosaur origins are kind of notoriously difficult to study because we don't have any transitional fossils. So how do your new discoveries about Scleromochlus fit into pterosaur origins, and in particular some of the newer studies that have come out about where we think pterosaurs come from now?
Yeah, of course. I cannot believe I didn't mention this before, actually. So, yeah, all the new information, I'll give you a little bit of stats. So, in the current phylogenetic analysis that we used, Scleromochlus was scored for about 20% of its characters.
Okay.
After our analysis and CT scanning, now we doubled the number. So we have 40%, which makes Scleromochlus one of the most complete animal around that time. And a lot of this information, as I mentioned, concern the extremities of bones or other area that were not easily identifiable in the peels. Fortunately, a lot of these extremities are diagnostic, so that tells us a lot of information regarding the relationship of animals to others. Like if you think of a femur of your thigh bone, if you only have the middle part of it, it doesn't tell you too much. There's a lot of more morphology at the extremities. So we were lucky that we were able to isolate some of these. And I mentioned the femur because it's specifically in this bone that we found some characteristic that are very similar to a group of terrestrial reptiles in the Triassic, which is called lagerpetid. So recently, a couple of years ago, time flies when you have fun. So a couple of years ago, Martinez Cura published a paper that linked these lagerpetids to the origin of pterosaurs. So in brief, lagerpetids are in the same archosaur group that dinosaur and birds are, and pterosaurs are. And Martin found that lagerpetid and pterosaurs have many characteristics in common. So they are also part of this bird-line archosaur group, but they are also a group on their own. And this group has been called Pterosauromorpha. So Pterosauromorpha is composed of lagerpetid on one side and then pterosaurs. Now, lagerpetid have older fossil record than pterosaurs have, which tells us that which can tell us information about the ancestors of pterosaurs. Scleromochlus, where does it fit here? Scleromochlus, we found it to be at the base of the lagerpetid lineage. So it has many characteristics in common with lagerpetid and slightly less with pterosaurs. So it is not a direct ancestor of pterosaurs. It is not a pterosaur. I just throw that it's not a dinosaur as well because it's good to do that. But it can, because of this position, its basal position nearby the roots of lagerpetid, it can tell us a lot of about the common ancestor of both pterosaurs and lagerpetid themselves.
So if it's not an ancestral pterosaur, do we have anything that's more closely related to pterosaurs, or is Scleromochlus kind of as close as we've got right now?
We don't. So there's still about a 15 to 18 million year fossil gap between pterosaurs and their closest relatives. It would be super cool to find one. And hopefully with this research, Martin's, mine, and all the other lagerpetid has been described even recently, hopefully we have a better idea of what we can look at.
Does any of this kind of help in terms of where we might look for where an ancestral pterosaur might be found, or any of those transitional fossils?
Yeah, so we have many deposits of the potentially right age. So the oldest pterosaur we have are about Norian, Middle Norian, in the late Triassic. So we have many deposits around this sort of interval in the late Triassic, and rather than telling us where to look, I think it's important that we have now more tool to recognize this fossil. It may be that we already found those and they are sitting somewhere in a drawer to be more fully understood. This has been the case for, Scleromochlus itself, many of the other lagerpetid that have been variously assigned to dinosaurs groups or other archosaur or avemetatarsalia, so bird-line archosaur groups. But now we have more tools and more knowledge to understand how a pre-pterosaur transitional form would look like.
So now are you just going to go around to a bunch of different museums and look at all of the stuff they've found from that age and see if anything looks like a kind of pterosaur line reptile?
I'm sure there'll be plenty of people that will do that. I moved a little further back in time in the Permian at the moment, but yes, it's. I think this has actually already happened with a recent discovery from South America, but also North America, and yeah, it's useful to revise old specimens, and that's also sort helps you advancing the science.
Yeah, it does sort of seem like in the past, all of our kind of oldest pterosaurs were all from sort of the same area, and now we've got them coming out in other places around the world, which is exciting because hopefully we'll be getting more information.
Yeah, and these sort of study completely changed the picture of what we know, because we may have thought that pterosaurs were just from us originating in a single area, but the fact that we have multiple different species across the globe at a short interval of time, it tells us that they were already diverse then. So there are certainly biases in the fossil record, we know that. And sometimes it's hard to account for them, but more and more new data and more techniques to look at these distribution patterns can help understand this question.
Do you think we're ever going to solve the question of where did pterosaurs come from?
I want to be optimistic, and I'm going to say yes. I sincerely hope so. If we keep looking, there's a good chance we'll find some extra bits here and there. I think this happens almost for every group. Like if you look at the state of what we knew about the origin of archosaurs 20 years ago, 20, 30 years ago, and now that's completely changed. And that's new discovery, and what the new discovery tells us about old specimens, and it's a perpetuating circle. So I don't think we're gonna run out of job.
And I'll obviously plug this as the person who runs a CT scanner, but things like new technology, which, you've got 100-year-old fossil, but you can put it into a new scanner, or, whatever new technology is going to come out in the next 20 years, we don't know. And maybe that will help answer the questions too.
Yeah, absolutely. And Scleromochlus is a super good example of this, because there's literally no other way to study these animals, to capture these details that were hidden. You cannot prepare it, so you have to photograph it somehow, and CT scans have been the answer for this.
It's just a giant plug for CT scanning, isn't it?
Yeah.
Really,
you're welcome.
just the whole point. Just to kind of finish off, you mentioned obviously that there's lots of work that can be done still on Scleromochlus, and some of which is sort of planned. But are you still planning on kind of moving this forward? And what do you think is sort of the next biggest thing that needs to be done with Scleromochlus?
Yes. So this paper pretty much tells us what is new about Scleromochlus. We plan to explore a little bit more the implication of this. So I plan to explore a little bit more what Scleromochlus in this phylogenetic position means for the evolution of the whole group, as well as give a expanded description of individual bones, which we are working on at the moment. So having a expanded atlas of this specimen that's been for so long misunderstood would be probably very useful. And I mean, in terms of other reptiles for the Elgin areas, yes, there's still plenty of work to do. We got scans. We are working on those slowly. There's multiple projects that we are looking at.
Oh, that certainly sounds very exciting. Lots of new things, minus the describing every single bone. I personally do not find that as exciting.
But fortunately, that is essentially done. So just final touches into it.
Well, I look forward to seeing what else you find out about Scleromochlus, especially the kind of biomechanics-y stuff, obviously, because I think that's the coolest.
Yes, thank you very much.
And yeah, thank you for joining me, and good luck with it in the future.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Paleocast was brought to you by Dave Marshall and Liz Martin Silverstone, with contributions from Tom Fletcher, Vish Venkat, and Elsa Pancharoli. Music was composed by Patrick Kendall Smith. Paleocast was made possible by funding from the Paleontological Society and the Paleontological Association, but the show now relies on funding from you, the listeners. So, if you've liked this episode, please consider donating, and thanks to everyone that's helped out so far. Please visit paleocast.com for the supplementary material to this episode and for our archive of past programs, and follow us across social media platforms to get all the latest news. Finally, if you enjoy our podcast, then please explore all of our video content on YouTube and follow our other projects, the Virtual Natural History Museum and the Paleocast Gaming Network.